First of all, I think it's good that people are talking about it because, again, when I was growing up in the 60s, that never left anybody's mind. Everyone was acutely sensitive to it. And the one thing that we all accepted was that Russia exists. The Soviet Union is the Soviet Union. We may not like it, but it exists. So we have to find a way to get along with them because the alternative is Armageddon. Everybody understood that. That's a good thing. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is infinitely better and more humane than the Soviet Union ever was. Instead of applauding that, we seem now to want to destroy it. So that baffles me beyond belief. But there are other issues here. I think we need to at least welcome some good news. The French, and Mr. Macron in particular, who was the first to open his mouth and talk about we cannot allow Mr. Putin to win. We cannot allow the Russians to win. And I will commit troops and I will send 20,000 troops. They've all walked it back. The spokesman for the French foreign ministry said, no, we don't support that. And now they've said we have no troops in Ukraine. Well, they have some French soldiers and officers in Ukraine. So do we. So do other NATO countries that have been there as advisors and have operate on a, like contractors, supporting them with intelligence and advice. But he's made it very clear there will be no French force marching east into Russia, into Ukraine under any circumstances. So that's good. And I think Lavrov did the right thing when he summoned both of them and laid down the law. Now, in the meantime, our spokesmen have reiterated that we will not put troops into Ukraine. I think that's a good thing. Nothing is being heard from London. And I think that the British people need to understand that the Russians are quite serious. If in fact they supply these strike weapons in great numbers to the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians can destroy Russian infrastructure and kill Russian citizens, the British will pay a price for that. British citizens will be killed, British troops will be killed, British installations will be destroyed. That's not an idle threat. Everyone needs to understand that the Russians, with the missile arsenal at their disposal, the Iskander, the Kinzhal, these things are very precise with great range. In fact, they can target everything from the Arctic Circle on the northern end of Norway all the way to southern Portugal. Last time I looked at the targeting capability, the range, there was a small piece of southern Portugal in the very south where the Atlantic sort of swims around into the Gibraltar area that could not be reached. That's it. And they don't have to hit that much. The Germans need to wake up. And I think they've begun to. I think Scholz has said this war has to end one way or the other. That's good news because this business of having demonized your opponent or the people that you don't like, beyond all rationality, by the way, makes it impossible under normal circumstances for you to suddenly do business with someone you said was the devil himself. And if we go back to World War II, there were large numbers of people in the British General Staff. If you read the memoirs of Alan Brooke, the unexpurgated memoirs, by the way, not the ones that were made to sound nice so that people would not read the truth about Churchill. The Imperial General Staff was very concerned about Soviet Union and communism and the power that lived there, and kept arguing over and over and over again. We don't want to replace Hitler with Stalin. We don't want to destroy Nazi Germany and then end up with Stalin and communism in charge. We all know how the war ended, but they at least were reasonable and thinking these things through. We never did. The point I'm trying to make is that there needs to be some clear-headed thinking right now at the top. We cannot impose our value system, whatever it is, because I think we're terrible hypocrites, on everyone else. And yet that seems to be the obsession of people like Blinken and Biden and others in that administration. Either you measure up to us and what we think a good little Anglo-Saxon Democrat is supposed to be, or you deserve the worst. This is all nonsense. As I told somebody the other day, I said, we keep talking about free and fair elections. Where I grew up in Philadelphia, we haven't had a free and fair election in 60 years. So stop talking to me about how lily white and pure we are. It's nonsense. everything that happens in Washington is really a function of money. If you want to know why people do the things they do, in most cases, you have to follow the money. I wish I could tell the British people and the rest of the world that we are ruled by a class of people who are desperately devoted to their country and will always try to find the right answer, but that's not the case. When it comes to Ukraine, Ukraine is an unmitigated catastrophe. Our influence in that country, our insistence on this proxy war, our determination to make this Ukrainian puppet state fight to the bitter end for what ostensibly are our interests, even though I don't agree with them, has produced a human tragedy. I think over a year ago, I was on with you and I said that we were up to approximately 500,000 Ukrainian dead. All sorts of people then attacked me saying that's impossible. Well, today we're up to at least 600,000 dead. And within the last week or so, they've lost 8,000 killed. This entire bill and everything associated with it is a travesty. It's a travesty because there's no one to utilize the weapons that we are sending. And the weapons that the Ukrainians have been using recently as sort of revenge weapons, long-range strike weapons against Russians on Russian territory, those are operated largely by NATO contractors, soldiers, officers. And it needs to stop. This war is over. It's not a question of Russia winning it. It's over. There's nothing left to fight with in Ukraine. There are no more people showing up. You can't train anybody in a very short period of time to do very much. And so the humane thing to do in Washington and London is to say, stop. Let's sit down, and we have to accept the fact that this is lost and find out what the Russians want and move forward from that point. But nobody wants to do that. The ruling class doesn't want to admit that it's been wrong. And Washington simply has a laundering machine when it comes to money. They constantly spend on defense, but much of that money goes into the pockets of contractors, and these are the big donors and the corporations. It finds its way into political action committees for people's reelection campaigns. It's not just defense. It applies to the pharmaceutical industry. It applies to foreign lobbies, any number of different things. The whole machinery of government right now is mired in this swamp of corruption. Now, people will say, well, have they broken laws? Well, you can legalize corruption, and that's what we've done. So I would call it a form of legalized corruption. Now, how do you fix something like that? Well, barring anything short of a Cromwellian revolution, you can't. And that's the difficulty right now. People expect whoever wins in the next election, assuming we have an election in November, is supposed to rescue us. Well, I don't think it's going to happen because they have to deal with the Congress, with the Senate and the House. And this is not a new development, by the way. It's probably the worst that it's ever been, but there was a time in the late 1800s, turn of the century, when the railroads controlled the votes in Congress. And people that owned mining interests and so forth. Then later on, we had Standard Oil, the largest corporation in the human history. But we then turned and we broke these things up. That's what Teddy Roosevelt did. And breaking up those monopolies and forcing people into a different setting did have a positive impact on us. We need something like that again. But at the moment, I think the Hill, that is the Congress, the Senate and the House, are far stronger in the bureaucracy that supports them than any president who comes into office. So I don't know how we fix any of those things. So that's the first thing that I think we need to keep in mind. And your second question was, Ukraine and Israel have hurt the American brand. Well, I think our brand is probably worse off than it's ever been in our history. You know, one of the things I've told people repeatedly, if you want to find a Muslim country where we're popular, it's because there are no Americans in it. No American military presence or anything else. In fact, I would not say that exclusively about a Muslim country. I'd say it about any country. Now, we are not very popular right now because we've supported this disastrous war in Ukraine. The truth about the war is out there. It may not have reached everybody in the West and in the United States, but I think it has reached the rest of the world. The problem in Israel is very straightforward. people like me, I've supported Israel frankly, all of my life. But I can't support the current policy in Gaza. And unfortunately, the Israel lobby, which is a very powerful entity with a lot of money, it is not, strictly speaking, a foreign lobby because the people contributing to it are in the United States. And that very powerful lobby can make or break people on the Hill and candidates and politicians. And so now we're in this unfortunate situation where if you object to the policy of mass expulsion and potentially mass murder, which I think is happening, then you're an anti-Semite. Well, that's a quick turnaround, especially for millions of people like me who have always supported the Israeli state, simply because we viewed it as this amazing concentration of talent and human capital that could play a very positive role, not just in the Middle East, but in the world. And I think after the 73 war, with the resolution of that war with Egypt, a lot of us thought this is a wonderful development. We're going to eventually reach a point where people will view Israel as a conduit for economic prosperity and communication with the rest of the world. I think that was beginning to happen. All of that's now destroyed. I don't know how you get it back if you ever do. And so this is the struggle that we have. And again, this is part of our problem as this sort of declining hegemon. We are responsible for our own decline. It's not because somebody defeated us in a war and drove us into ruin. It's because we've overextended ourselves. We've meddled everywhere. And there's been no strategy. There's still no strategy in the United States. If you ask somebody, what are your national interests? You're going to get 100 different answers. Most of them are wrong. Our interests are actually quite simple. And if you go back far enough in our history, our preeminent goal was to do business with everyone. We weren't in the business of sanctioning people here or there. Somebody was reminding me the other day that the Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, had a very important role to play in the American Civil War because the British and the French fleets presented a danger to us. So he told President Lincoln, would it be all right if I simply parked the Russian fleet in American ports during the winter, since they had very few ice-free ports? And Lincoln, of course, was very grateful because once the Russian fleet was there, we knew the British and the French weren't going to interfere with us. You had something similar with the Germans. Bismarck was probably the greatest single admirer of Lincoln, and he allowed hundreds of thousands of young Germans to enlist in the U.S. Army for the purpose of going to America, serving honorably for the duration of the war, and becoming American citizens. A lot of Germans didn't like that, said, you're letting too much German capital leave. And he said, well, that may be true, but I support the cause. So here you have an example of Germans and Russians who were absolutely essential to our development as a great power. We've thrown all of that away. I don't think anyone would want to help us do much of anything. But at the same time, we are hostage to the interests of smaller countries. We're hostage to Israel's interests. We're hostage to Polish interests. Just go down the list. Any nation in the world that has become a quote unquote ally. That's something we never wanted. We wanted to be a partner, potentially. We wanted to be a business partner. We wanted to help and assist, but we did not want to become hostage to someone else's interests and behavior. But that's where we are right now. And as a result, we are now this broken, financially ruined hegemon. Where are we going to go from here? Well, eventually it's going to end. We're going to have to pull out, retrench. We're going to be in the same position the British Empire was after the Second World War. It's only a matter of time. A lot of Americans sense that. I personally welcome that. I think we need to get out of other people's business. But that's not popular in Washington because the so-called empire, we refer to it in those terms, is big business. I mean, if you compare the money that the Department of Defense receives for its overseas commitments, and look at the money that it would probably receive if we simply defended our borders and our coastal waters and got out of the business of meddling everywhere, it would be minuscule. So you're not going to see anybody stand up inside the Pentagon and say, oh, let's defend America. Let's defend the Western Hemisphere. But that's really where we belong. And we've got to get out of the Eastern Hemisphere.
Colonel, if you had to fast forward 4 years from now, what do you think the situation looks like in Ukraine? And what do you think the situation looks like in Israel?
I think A lot depends on the financial system and on the economic conditions. I think that by the end of this year, something we have been anticipating will have begun to happen. I always go back to Nassim Taleb. He's the brilliant financial analyst, market analyst who talked about black swans. And in recent interviews, when he was pressed, they said, you said we're unsustainable. We can't continue to go on as we have, but we've been doing it for years. And he says, Armageddon is just over the horizon. So then the people questioning him on MSNBC said, well, what's that mean? When is this going to happen? In other words, you're the fortune teller. Tell us what day everything collapses so we can all run to the bank and get our money or something. He says, look, I can't pinpoint the date, but it's closer than it's ever been. It's just over the horizon. I think he's right. Debt financed consumption is a dead end. It is. Either you manufacture and produce or you don't. Either your currency is worth something or it's not. We could spend hours and you'll have lots of people who come on and tell you that the unsustainable status quo can go on for another decade. I don't think so. And the other thing that we've learned is that the rest of the world can get along without us. We took the position that if we sanction you and you're financially strangled by us, you have no chance of survival. That was the expectation of Russia. How's that worked out? It hasn't. So I think the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, if you just look at the BRICS, look at the other 70 countries lined up to join them, I think the handwriting's on the wall. Our old system, our old way of doing business is about to go away. We're going to have to make change, but we don't want to. This is the problem when you have been, for a long time, a regional hegemon. We were always a regional hegemon, almost from the beginning when we became a country. We were always stronger than the rest of the people in North America. And we were happy as a regional hegemon. And being a regional hegemon, frankly, was enough. But then we decided to dabble in other people's wars, and eventually we developed this ambition to be a global hegemon. And that ambition seemed to come to fruition in 1992. And we swallowed the illusion that we had finally taken over. The world was ours. Or as I think Hitler said in Vienna, I am the pearl and Vienna is my setting, something ridiculous like that. It's the same sort of stupidity. It's what got Trotsky in trouble. And one of the reasons that he lost power, because Stalin said the world doesn't really want communism. If we're going to spread it, it'll have to be spread by the bayonet. And they learned the hard way. Trotsky said, the Poles will come over to us. The working class of Poland will join us in the global Bolshevik crusade. It didn't work out. We've reached the land of fantasy. And we don't want to let that fantasy go. And you've got a lot of people that depend upon the fantasy for their income, their station. They've talked themselves into the fantasy world, and you're asking them to suddenly wake up and tell the truth? Not going to happen. So between now and the end of the year, I think things could get very, very dicey. Just imagine the impact that it will have when it becomes abundantly clear to everyone, to the point where you cannot conceal it, that we have failed miserably in Ukraine. And we did essentially what Mr. Netanyahu has done. We turned Ukraine into this existential threat, this war with the evil Russians. It was nonsense. Netanyahu has done that in Israel. When you do that, you put everything at risk. It's sort of roll the dice. And that's not how you govern. That's not how anybody should